there is a pair of boots sitting just inside the door, mud-caked, worn at the heel. The leather has been softened by years of real use, the kind that comes from riding out before dawn, checking fences in the rain, walking the edges of fields that needed walking. Not the boots of a general, not the boots of a president, the boots of a farmer who believed, even at 67, that land required watching and that no weather was a good enough reason to stay inside. On a morning in mid-December, 1799, George Washington pulled on those boots and rode out into the cold. The Potomac was hidden that morning beneath a low grey mist. The fields of Mount Vernon sloped quietly down toward the water, bare, unhurried, still holding the shape of another year nearly finished. The trees along the river had given up their leaves weeks ago. They stood without apology in the pale light, their reflections broken on the surface of the water below. The morning started cold and clear, the way December sometimes opens in Virginia, bright enough to make you think the day will be kind. But the sky closed over by mid-morning, and sleet began to fall through the bare branches along the lane. He did not hurry. Those around him would later remember that he moved from field to field with the same attentiveness he had always brought to this place, reading the fences, the soil, the quiet winter geometry of the orchards. He came in when he was ready. Inside, the house was warm. Martha was nearby. The fires had been laid. He sat and warmed himself, and outside the sleet continued to fall on the fields he had spent a lifetime building. Mount Vernon was not the estate he had inherited. It was the estate he had made. Room by room, field by field, decade by decade, shaped and added to the way a life is shaped, one decision at a time, until the whole thing felt, from the outside, like it had always been exactly this way. This would be one of the last ordinary mornings of his life. But we are not there yet. To understand the man who came home to this house, who rode out into a December cold he had no business riding out into, who moved through his land with the careful attention of someone who had learned long ago never to take a single morning for granted, we must go back past the presidency, past the war, past the uniform and the legend and the face on the currency, back to a boy in Virginia, a boy who lost his father at 11 years old, and who grew up carrying something that never quite left him, the particular discipline of someone who understood early that nothing would simply be given, that everything, the land, the standing, the life worth living, would have to be built by hand. That is where this story begins. Not in glory, not in victory. In a house without a father, and in the silence that followed him, in one form or another, all the way to the end. Some educations begin in classrooms. His began with a notebook and a compass, one teaching him the rules of the world he wanted to enter, the other teaching him the shape of the world as it actually was. There is a notebook, small, hand-stitched, the kind of thing a boy keeps because something in him decided it mattered. Inside, written in a careful, deliberate hand, are 110 rules. Rules for how a gentleman sits at table. Rules for how he addresses someone above his station. Rules for how he enters a room, how he listens, how he holds himself when the world is watching. Sleep not when others speak. Sit not when others stand. Associate yourself with men of good quality if you esteem your own reputation. Labour to keep alive in your breast that little spark of celestial fire called conscience. George Washington copied these rules by hand when he was around 14 years old. He chose them from a set of conduct guidelines translated from a French Jesuit text nearly a century earlier, and wrote them slowly, carefully, in the same methodical hand he would use for the rest of his life when something mattered. They were not just rules. They were a map of a world he intended to enter and had not yet been shown how. Virginia, in the 1730s, was a place that rewarded men who already had something. Land was the foundation of everything, of wealth, of standing, of the particular kind of respect that moved quietly through a room before a man even opened his mouth. The great families of the Tidewater had been accumulating it for generations. The Lees, the Carters, the Birds. They built their houses on the high ground above the rivers, sent their sons to England to be educated, and returned to find those sons already carrying themselves like men who belonged to the world they had been born into. Augustine Washington belonged to that world, but only just. He was a planter, a landowner, a man of some standing in Westmoreland County, but the Washingtons had not yet arrived at the upper tier of Virginia society, the tier where wealth was old enough to feel inevitable, where a family name alone opened doors before a word was spoken. Augustine was still in the middle of building, still consolidating. He had enough standing to see the upper reaches of that world clearly, the way you can see the far bank of a wide river on a clear day without having found the easiest way across. On the 22nd of February, 1732, his wife, Mary Ball Washington, gave birth to their first child together, a son. They named him George. He was the third of Augustine's children, after two older half-brothers from a previous marriage, Lawrence and Augustine Jr. He came into a household that was full, complicated, and stretched across competing priorities. There was land, there was standing, there was enough. But enough, in the Virginia of that era, was not the same as assured. Lawrence and Augustine Jr. had been sent to Appleby Grammar School in England, the kind of education that did not simply fill a mind, but shaped a manner. It taught a boy how to enter a room, how to hold a conversation with someone of higher station without reaching for it, how to move through worlds that required a certain invisible fluency to navigate. George would not receive it. By the time it came to planning his schooling, the family's circumstances had shifted enough that sending another son across the Atlantic was no longer possible. The door that had opened for Lawrence and Augustine Jr. closed, quietly and without explanation, before George was old enough to fully understand what had been decided for him. He learned from local tutors instead. Reading, writing, arithmetic, the practical formation of a boy who would need to make his own way. He showed an early aptitude for mathematics, for the kind of precise, spatial thinking that found satisfaction in measurement and order. Those who remembered him from those years described someone who observed more than he spoke, who held himself with a watchful restraint unusual in a child. The world he was watching was one in which position had to be earned, and he was watching it very carefully. In the spring of 1743, Augustine Washington fell ill. The details of his illness are not well preserved. What is preserved is the date, April 12th, 1743. Augustine died at his farm on the Rappahannock River. He was 49 years old. There was no recorded final conversation, no last words that history has chosen to keep. Augustine simply died, the way men died in the 18th century, with little warning and less ceremony, and left behind a wife, 6 children, and an estate divided carefully but not generously among his sons. Lawrence received the property on the Potomac, the estate that would one day be known as Mount Vernon. Augustine Jr. received the farm on Pope's Creek. George received the farm on the Rappahannock, along with 10 enslaved people and a small sum of money. Not a fortune, not a foundation. The materials for one, if he could figure out what to do with them. He was 11 years old. Washington never wrote at length about his father's death. There is no journal entry, no letter that opens the door to whatever he felt that spring. What he carried quietly, but the record of what he did in the years that followed speaks in its own way. Into the space left by his father stepped his older half-brother Lawrence, 14 years older, educated at Appleby, a former officer who had served under Admiral Edward Vernon in the Caribbean, a man who had come home to Virginia carrying the ease of someone who had seen the world and found himself equal to it. He named the Potomac estate after his former commander. He married into the powerful Fairfax family. He moved through rooms that George, at 12, could only observe from the edges. But Lawrence let him observe. More than that, he brought him in. George spent long stretches at Mount Vernon during those years, watching how Lawrence carried himself, how he spoke with the Fairfaxes, how a man of standing moved through the world. It was an education of a different kind, less formal, but perhaps more useful for a boy who was going to have to learn everything from the inside out. Through the Fairfax connection, George was introduced to Lord Thomas Fairfax, one of the largest landholders in Virginia, a man whose property stretched into the unsurveyed western territories beyond the Blue Ridge. Fairfax took a liking to the serious, attentive young man who listened more than he spoke and asked better questions than most grown men did. And it was through Fairfax that Washington found, at 15, the thing that would become his first real foothold in the world. Surveying, to walk a piece of land, to measure it with precision, to take wilderness and return it as something knowable, mappable, owned. It was, on its surface, a practical trade. Men who could accurately measure land were in constant demand on the Virginia frontier, where boundaries were contested and new territory was being claimed and parcelled as fast as it could be walked. But for George Washington, at 15 and 16, surveying was something beyond a trade. The compass in his hand did not care who his father was, or whether he had studied at Appleby, or what the Carters and the Byrds thought of the Washingtons. It only cared whether the measurement was accurate. He took to it with the same deliberate intensity he had brought to copying those 110 rules. He was out on the frontier by 16, camping in rough conditions, crossing rivers, moving through terrain that did not accommodate inexperience. The frontier tested all of that. He did not find himself wanting. Years later, Washington wrote to his nephew Bushrod, plainly, without self-pity, that he had no formal education to speak of, no Appleby, no years in England shaping his manner against the grain of better-born men. What he had learned from observation, from the land, from the discipline of someone who understood that nothing would simply arrive on its own. He did not write it as a complaint. He wrote it as a fact. But between the lines of that plain admission, the boy is still visible, the one who watched a door close before he could reach it, who picked up a compass instead, who copied 110 rules for how a gentleman moves through the world. The notebook had taught him everything it could. What came next would not be found in any book. It was already waiting for him, out past the last farm, past the last familiar road, in the unmapped territory, where the only thing that mattered was whether your measurements were accurate and whether you could endure what the land was asking of you. He had the compass. He had the discipline. He had the particular hunger of someone who understood, earlier than most, that the world does not open itself to those who wait for an invitation. He went. There is a compass, brass, pocket-sized, the kind a surveyor carries through all weather. The needle settles north, regardless of what is happening around it, regardless of noise, cold, confusion, the particular chaos of a frontier that has not yet decided what it wants to be. You hold it level. You wait, and the needle tells you where you are. George Washington had been carrying one for years before anyone handed him a sword. He had learned to trust the instrument before he learned to trust much else, learned that in a world where rank and birth and the right family name determined almost everything, a compass was one of the few things that did not lie. It told you where you stood. It told you which direction was forward. And it did not care who your father was. What he could not have known, riding into the wilderness at 16 with his surveying tools and his careful notebooks, was that everything the frontier was teaching him, the patience, the physical endurance, the ability to read terrain and make decisions without anyone to consult, was preparation for something he had not yet imagined. The land was getting him ready. He just did not know for what. Lawrence Washington died in the summer of 1752. He had been ill for some time, tuberculosis, slow and patient and final. He had travelled to Barbados with George in the autumn of 1751, hoping the warmer climate might ease his condition. It did not. George contracted smallpox during that trip, a brief, survivable illness that left him immune for the rest of his life, a quiet piece of luck that no one could have planned for. He was the second father George Washington had lost. The transition of Mount Vernon to Washington's hands was not immediate or simple. The property passed first to Lawrence's widow, with George as the likely eventual heir. He leased the estate in the interim, learning its rhythms from a distance, and turned his attention to what came next. What came next, as it turned out, was the frontier, but this time not as a surveyor measuring boundaries for wealthy planters. This time as a soldier. In 1752, the Lieutenant Governor of Virginia appointed Washington as a district militia adjutant, a militia officer responsible for training and organizing local defense forces. He had no formal military training. What he had was years of frontier experience, a knowledge of the actual physical land that almost no Virginia gentleman possessed, and the willingness to go where other men declined to go. He was 20 years old. He accepted. The trouble that had been building along the Ohio Valley came to a head the following year. France and Britain had been circling each other for years over control of the vast interior of the continent, the land beyond the Appalachians, drained by the Ohio River, claimed by both empires and occupied by neither with any real permanence. The French had begun constructing a chain of forts to assert their claim. The British needed to respond. Lieutenant Governor Robert Dinwiddie of Virginia sent Washington, now 21, tall, steady, and willing, into the wilderness to deliver a message to the French commander at Fort Le Boeuf. The mission was diplomatic in form and nearly impossible in practice. Travel hundreds of miles through winter wilderness, find the French, deliver the demand that they withdraw, and return with their answer. Washington went. He nearly drowned crossing the Allegheny River when ice floes swept him off a makeshift raft and into the freezing current. He spent a night on a small island, soaked and exposed, waiting for the river to freeze solid enough to walk across by morning. He delivered the message. He brought back the French refusal. He was back in Williamsburg by mid-January. Dinwiddie published the journal Washington kept of the journey. People read about the young officer who had walked into the winter wilderness and come back with what he was sent to find. A name began, very quietly, to travel. The following year, 1754, Washington led a small force back into the Ohio Valley, this time not as a messenger but as a soldier. In late May, acting on intelligence about a French scouting party moving through the forest, Washington led a pre-dawn attack on the encampment of a French officer named Joseph Coulon de Jumonville. The engagement lasted perhaps 15 minutes. Jumonville and 9 of his men were killed. It was George Washington's first military action. It was also, in ways that no one fully understood at the time, one of the opening provocations of a conflict that would eventually become the 7 Years' War, a war fought across 3 continents, reshaping the boundaries of empire from India to the Caribbean to the American frontier. Washington was 22 years old. He had no idea what he had started. The consequences arrived quickly. A much larger French force trapped Washington and his men at a hastily constructed stockade he had named Fort Necessity, built in a low meadow that the French could fire down into from the surrounding high ground. The battle lasted through a rainy July 4th, 1754, with Washington's men fighting from muddy trenches as the rain turned their powder wet and their numbers climbed downward. He surrendered that night. The terms allowed him to march his men out with their arms, a concession the French made for their own reasons. Washington returned to Virginia, having lost his first real battle, having contributed to igniting a world war, and having learned more in 6 months than most officers absorbed in years. He resigned his commission, frustrated by the way the British military treated colonial officers as beneath consideration regardless of what they had done or endured. The frustration did not last long. The following year, 1755, he was back. British General Edward Braddock had arrived in Virginia with 2 regiments of professional soldiers, tasked with driving the French from the Ohio Valley once and for all. Washington joined Braddock's expedition as a volunteer aide-de-camp, no formal rank, no official command, but a place near the centre of things where he could watch and learn. On the 9th of July, 1755, Braddock's column was ambushed on a narrow road through the forest, 8 miles from Fort Duquesne. The French and their Native American allies materialized from the trees on both flanks and opened fire from positions the British could neither see clearly nor reach. The professional soldiers, trained for the open battlefields of Europe, bunched together on the road and were cut apart with terrible efficiency. Braddock himself was shot from his horse. 4 horses were shot from under Washington. 2 bullets passed through his coat without touching his body. He rode through it anyway, back and forth through the collapsing column, carrying Braddock's orders, trying to organize a retreat. When it was over, nearly 1,000 British and colonial soldiers had been killed or wounded. Braddock died 4 days later, on the road back to Virginia. Washington had been the last officer still mounted. He wrote to his mother the following week with the plainness he always used when he wanted her not to worry, telling her he had been in the engagement, that he had not been hurt, that something had seemed to preserve him from harm in a way he could not account for. He had 4 bullet holes in his coat. He did not mention the bullet holes. The years that followed, 1755 through 1758, were grinding rather than glorious. Washington commanded Virginia's frontier defences with limited men and scarce supplies, writing letter after letter, requesting resources that arrived late or not at all, arguing for treatment of his soldiers that he considered basic, and receiving in return the patient condescension of officers who outranked him by virtue of a commission purchased in London. He fought skirmishes. He buried men. He learned the difference between courage and competence, and began to understand that the second was harder to build and more durable than the first. In 1758, he helped lead the final British push that took Fort Duquesne from the French. The fort fell without a major engagement. The French burned it themselves and withdrew. Washington resigned his commission for the second time and rode home to Mount Vernon. He was 26 years old. He had survived 2 near deaths, 1 surrender, 1 accidental world war, and several years of being treated as less than he knew himself to be. He had also, in the quiet, compass-carrying part of himself, been taking notes the entire time, on what leadership looked like from the inside, on what an army needed and what happened when it did not have those things, on the difference between men who held rank and men who deserved it. He did not know yet that he would need all of it. He rode back to Mount Vernon through the late autumn fields of Virginia, past the familiar rivers and the tobacco land and the bare trees along the Potomac, toward a life he had been trying to get back to since he was 20 years old, toward a key hanging by a door, toward a woman he had not yet met, and a house that was not yet finished, and 15 years of quiet that were about to become the most important preparation of his life. There is a key, plain iron, unremarkable in the hand, the kind of key that exists in the thousands across the Virginia tidewater, hanging on hooks beside 10,000 doors. But this one opened Mount Vernon, and for a man who had spent the better part of his 20s riding into wildernesses, sleeping on frozen ground, and watching other men die on forest roads, this key, and the door it opened, meant something that no battlefield commission ever had. He was coming home. For the first time in his adult life, he was actually coming home. George Washington arrived at Mount Vernon in January of 1759 as its full owner at last. He was 26 years old. He had a plantation, a key, and the particular relief of a man who has finally been given permission to stop proving himself, at least for a while. He also, as of January 6th of that year, had a wife. Martha Dandridge Custis was 27 when Washington married her, a widow, small in stature, precise in manner, and in possession of one of the larger fortunes in Virginia. Her first husband, Daniel Parker Custis, had died 2 years earlier, leaving her with 2 children, John, called Jackie, and Martha, called Patsy, and an estate of considerable size and complexity. She was not a romantic figure in the way that later centuries would sometimes try to make her. She was something more useful than that. She was competent. She was organized. She understood land and money and the management of a large household with the same fluency that Washington brought to the management of a military column. When the two of them sat down together to consider their futures, practically as adults who had both already seen enough of the world to know what they needed, what they found in each other was a kind of recognition. This was a partnership, built on affection, yes, built on respect, certainly, but built above all on the understanding that 2 capable people working in the same direction could accomplish more than either could manage alone. He was not being poetic when he wrote to a friend that he believed he had found in Martha all the happiness that this life could afford. He was being precise. The 15 years that followed were the quietest of George Washington's life. He rose at dawn. He rode the fields. He managed the crops, tobacco first, then wheat as the tobacco market grew difficult, and the soil showed the strain of decades of heavy planting. He served in the Virginia House of Burgesses, attending sessions in Williamsburg, learning the rhythms of legislative argument and the patience required to move a room toward a decision it had not yet decided to make. He improved the House. Mount Vernon grew during these years the way Washington himself had grown, deliberately, incrementally, with attention paid to proportion and detail. He added the north wing. He raised the roof. He extended the piazza along the east-facing side until it looked out over the lawn and the river with the kind of easy authority that takes years to achieve. He kept meticulous records of everything, the planting dates, the yields, the costs, the weather. He was building something, not just a house, not just a plantation, something that looked, from the outside, like the life of a man who had arrived. But Mount Vernon was never only what it looked like from the outside. The fields that Washington walked each morning, the ones that produced the wheat and the corn and the fruit that made the estate function, were worked by enslaved people. Men and women and children who rose before Washington did, who worked longer hours than he did, who built and maintained the physical fabric of everything he was so carefully accumulating. Washington had inherited enslaved people from his father. He had acquired more through his marriage to Martha, whose Custis estate brought its own enslaved workforce into the household. By the time he was in his late 30s, Mount Vernon held more than 100 people in bondage. He managed them the way he managed everything else, with attention, with records, with the practiced efficiency of a man who understood that an estate ran on labour and that labour had to be organised. What he did not do, at least not in these years, was look directly at the institution itself. The contradiction between the freedom he was beginning to believe his country deserved and the bondage on which his own comfort rested was present. It was visible to anyone who cared to see it. Washington, in these years, did not look. The beauty of those afternoons on the Potomac was real. The satisfaction of a well-run estate, of a marriage that worked, of a life that had finally found its shape, all of it was real. It was also built on something that would not bear looking at directly, and he chose not to look. Outside the walls of Mount Vernon, the world was changing in ways that would not allow anyone to simply keep going indefinitely. The Stamp Act of 1765 had sparked outrage across the colonies, a direct tax imposed by a parliament in which colonists had no representation. Washington had written at the time that the act was an unconstitutional reach, a violation of the rights that Englishmen were supposed to possess by birth. He was not yet a revolutionary. He was an Englishman who believed he was owed the rights of an Englishman, and who was beginning to understand that the Empire did not entirely agree. The Townshend Acts followed in 1767. Washington helped organize a non-importation agreement in Virginia, persuading his fellow planters to boycott British goods, stopping his own orders from London, wearing clothes made from American cloth. These were not small gestures. They were a man beginning to draw a line between what he had been and what he was becoming. And then, in the middle of all of it, grief came home. On the 19th of June, 1773, Patsy had a severe seizure at the dinner table. She was dead within 2 minutes. She was 17 years old. She had suffered from epilepsy since childhood, seizures that came without warning and left her exhausted and frightened, and that no physician of the era had any reliable means to treat. Washington had spent years trying to find someone who could help her, consulting doctors, trying various remedies, sitting with the particular helplessness of watching a child struggle with something entirely outside his ability to fix. Washington wrote in his diary that evening, with the brevity of a man who had run out of ways to hold what he was feeling inside the space of a single sentence. She rose from dinner and staggered into the passage where she was caught. In less than 2 minutes, she was dead. That is all he wrote. Martha was devastated in a way that she did not conceal and could not contain. Washington held the household together in the days that followed the way he had always held things together, quietly, practically, turning back to the work, because the work was always there, and grief did not make it go away. The house was quieter after Patsy died. Not the comfortable silence that had settled between Washington and Martha over the years of their marriage, a different kind. The kind that arrives when something has been removed and the space it occupied has not yet learned to close. Washington moved through it the way he moved through most things he could not fix. He kept going. By 1774, the committees of correspondence were coordinating colonial resistance across the Atlantic seaboard. The British Parliament had responded to the Boston Tea Party with the coercive acts, closing the port of Boston, revoking Massachusetts self-governance. Washington attended the First Virginia Convention in August and was selected as one of Virginia's delegates to the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia. He packed his bags. He kissed Martha. He walked past the key hanging by the door. He did not take it with him. There was no point. The life it opened, the fields, the house, the river, the careful 15 years of a man who had finally arrived, was going to have to wait. He could not have known, as he rode north toward Philadelphia in the late summer heat, that it would be years before he came home again, that the world he was riding toward would consume everything he had spent 15 years building, that the next letter he wrote to Martha, the most honest letter of his life, would not be written from Mount Vernon, but from a city where a continent's future was being decided by men who had just made him responsible for all of it. Some things cannot be known in advance. They can only be lived through. He rode north. The key stayed behind. There are 2 letters. They should not exist. Martha Washington burned nearly everything. Decades of correspondence between herself and her husband. Page after page of the private language 2 people build over a lifetime together. She burned them deliberately in the months before her own death in 1802. She had spent 40 years watching the public consume her husband piece by piece. The letters were the one thing left that belonged only to them. She would not give them up. But 2 letters survived. They were found decades later, tucked beneath the drawer of a small writing desk that had passed to her granddaughter. No one knows whether Martha left them there intentionally, a private act of preservation hidden inside a public act of destruction, or whether they simply escaped her attention in her final weeks. Historians have debated it ever since. The earlier of the 2 is dated June 18th, 1775. Washington had been in Philadelphia for the Second Continental Congress, and 4 days earlier the delegates had voted unanimously to appoint him Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. He sat down that evening and wrote to his wife. He did not write about strategy. He did not write about the coming war. He wrote about himself, with a candour he almost never allowed in public, and what he wrote was this: that he had used every means in his power to avoid the appointment, that he was not seeking it, that he was genuinely uncertain whether he was equal to the trust being placed in him, that he would have found more real happiness in 1 month at home with her than in 7 times 7 years of what lay ahead. But as it has been a kind of destiny, he wrote, that has thrown me upon this service, I shall hope that my undertaking of it is designed to answer some good purpose. Destiny, not glory, not ambition, destiny, the word a man uses when he has run out of ways to refuse. He enclosed a copy of his freshly drafted will with the letter. He was 43 years old, in good health, and preparing for the possibility that he would not come back. The army he was inheriting existed more in name than in fact. 16,000 men, roughly, gathered in camps around Boston, but men without adequate weapons, without sufficient powder, without the supply chains or the organizational structure that turned a gathering of willing individuals into a force capable of sustained military action. They had heart. They had grievance. They had, in many cases, a genuine understanding of what they were fighting for. What they did not have was almost everything else. Washington took command at Cambridge, Massachusetts, on the 3rd of July, 1775. He rode through the camp on a grey horse, inspecting what he had been given, and wrote that evening to his brother John Augustine with the plainness of a man who saw no point in pretending. The situation, he wrote, was considerably worse than he had been led to expect. The months that followed were a sustained exercise in building something from very little under the observation of an enemy who occupied Boston and could, at any moment, decide to come out and destroy what Washington was assembling. They did not come out. Washington used the reprieve. He imposed discipline on camps that had been running on revolutionary enthusiasm rather than military order. He argued constantly, persistently with a Continental Congress that understood the necessity of the army in principle and struggled to supply it in practice. He requisitioned weapons, powder, food, clothing, and medical supplies, and received in return a fraction of what he asked for, and a great deal of correspondence explaining why the rest was difficult. In the autumn of 1775, a young officer named Henry Knox proposed fetching the artillery captured at Fort Ticonderoga the previous spring, dragging 60 tons of cannon 300 miles over winter mountains, across frozen lakes, through terrain that had no interest in cooperating. Washington authorized it. Knox did it. The cannon arrived at Cambridge in January of 1776. Washington moved them to the high ground overlooking Boston Harbor in a single night. The British commander, General Howe, looked at the guns on Dorchester Heights the following morning and made the calculation Washington was hoping he would make. Within weeks, the British evacuated Boston entirely, 11,000 soldiers and more than 1,000 loyalist civilians, loading onto ships and sailing away from a city they had held for nearly a year. Washington's men cheered. He did not. He already knew that Boston was the easy part. The war moved to New York in the spring of 1776. Washington moved with it, understanding that the city was strategically essential and privately doubting whether he had the forces to hold it. He was right to doubt. On the 27th of August, 1776, General Howe landed 20,000 British and Hessian troops on Long Island and attacked with the professional precision of an army that had been doing this for generations. Washington's men fought with real courage and were outflanked anyway, driven back to the fortifications at Brooklyn Heights, trapped between the British army in front of them and the East River behind. What happened next was not a victory. But it was, in its own way, the demonstration that would define Washington's generalship more than any battle he ever won. On the night of August 29th, in darkness and fog that arrived as if arranged, Washington evacuated 9,000 men across the East River to Manhattan. Boats. Silence. One small unit held the lines until nearly dawn, making enough noise to suggest a full army still in place. By the time the British realized what had happened, Washington's army was gone. In the weeks that followed, the retreat continued through Manhattan, across the Hudson, into New Jersey, the army shrinking with each passing mile as enlistments expired and men drifted home. By December, Washington had perhaps 3,000 soldiers left. The enlistments of most of them expired at the end of the month. Thomas Paine, travelling with the army during those weeks, wrote the words that would become the most famous summary of that season. These are the times that try men's souls. He wrote them by firelight, on a drumhead, marching with an army that had almost nothing left. Washington wrote to his brother John Augustine that December, with the directness of a man who would not permit himself despair, but would not pretend the situation was other than it was. The game, he wrote, was pretty nearly up. He did not mean he was going to stop playing it. He meant he understood exactly how close to the edge they were standing. And that understanding, rather than breaking him, seemed to clarify something. Strip away everything except the essential question, and what remained was simple. What do you do next? A man who knows precisely how bad things are has a certain kind of freedom. He does not waste the night wondering if it is as serious as it looks. He knows it is. And then he gets up in the morning. What he decided on the Pennsylvania side of a frozen river in the last days of a year that had nearly destroyed everything, would not be cautious. It would not be safe. It would be exactly the kind of move that a man makes when he has run out of options and discovered, at the bottom of that emptiness, something that looks very much like clarity. The river was waiting, the ice was moving, and on the other side, in a garrison town called Trenton, an army that had stopped expecting to be attacked was about to find out what George Washington did when his back was against the wall. There are traces of blood on the frozen ground. Not many. Not enough to tell a story by themselves, but enough, pressed into the frozen mud by feet that had no business walking on frozen mud without proper shoes, enough to mark where an army had passed. Enough to tell anyone who looked closely that the men who came through here were not marching in comfort. They were marching because they had decided, or someone had decided for them, that stopping was not an option. Washington saw them. He wrote about them months later in a letter to a Virginia legislator named John Bannister, not as a rhetorical flourish, not to inspire, but as a plain description of what he had witnessed with his own eyes. To see men without shoes, by which their marches might be traced by the blood from their feet, marching through frost and snow, and submitting to it without a murmur, is a mark of patience and obedience which, in my opinion, can scarce be paralleled. He was not celebrating their suffering. He was bearing witness to it. There is a difference, and Washington, who had asked these men to endure things no man should have to endure, understood that difference in a way that never left him. This is the story of 2 winters. The first was the winter of a decision made in desperation that turned out to be exactly right. The second was the winter of endurance, of staying when every reasonable instinct said to go, of holding together something that had every reason to fall apart. Both winters made him, but only the second one showed what he was made of. December of 1776 was, by any reasonable measure, the end. Washington had retreated across New Jersey with what remained of his army, perhaps 3,000 men, most of them cold, exhausted, and facing the expiration of their enlistments on the 31st of the month. When those enlistments ran out, the army would cease to exist in any meaningful sense. The British had taken New York. They had taken most of New Jersey. They were wintering comfortably in garrisons across the state, waiting for spring, confident that the rebellion had finally broken itself against the wall of professional military force. On the Pennsylvania side of the Delaware River, Washington made a decision, not a strategic calculation exactly, or not only that. Something more fundamental, the kind of decision a man makes when he has looked at every alternative and found them all unacceptable. He would not wait for spring. He would not watch his army dissolve by expiration. He would cross the river on Christmas night, march 9 miles through a snowstorm to Trenton, New Jersey, and attack the Hessian garrison there before they had finished celebrating the holiday. The crossing began at dusk on December 25th, 1776. The Delaware was running hard with ice floes, thick, grinding sheets of river ice that the boats had to push through in the darkness. The storm that had been building all day had arrived in full, sleet, then snow, then a wind that made the torches useless and the footing on the river banks treacherous. 2 other contingents of Washington's force, assigned to cross at different points, turned back because of the conditions. Washington did not turn back. 2,400 men crossed the Delaware that night. It took until 3 in the morning. They were already hours behind schedule, already soaked, already cold in the particular way that cold becomes personal when you have been wet since nightfall, with no prospect of warmth before dawn. Washington's artillery commander, Henry Knox, was on the riverbank, directing men and horses and cannon through the darkness with the organizational energy of someone who refused to acknowledge that the situation was impossible. Washington stood on the New Jersey shore and waited for his army to arrive around him. They marched 9 miles in the storm. The roads were ice. Men fell. They got up. Some wrapped their feet in rags torn from their coats because the rags were better than nothing, and nothing was what many of them had. They arrived at the edge of Trenton just before 8 in the morning, half a day behind schedule, in a storm that had not relented. The attack went in anyway. The Hessians, professional soldiers, well-trained, well-equipped, were surprised in their quarters and overwhelmed before they could organize an effective defense. The battle lasted perhaps 45 minutes. Washington's men captured nearly 1,000 prisoners, significant quantities of supplies, and their first genuine military victory in months. Washington looked at what his army had done and immediately began planning to do it again. 4 days later, he crossed back into New Jersey and struck at Princeton, where a British column was moving to reinforce Trenton. The battle was sharper, more contested, and nearly came apart when Washington rode directly into the space between the two firing lines to rally his men, so exposed that his aides covered their faces rather than watch. He was not hit. He was, as he had been at Braddock's defeat, and would be again, preserved by something he himself could not explain, and eventually stopped trying to. 2 victories. In 2 weeks, in the worst winter of the war. It was not enough to win the revolution, but it was enough to keep it alive. And keeping it alive, at that particular moment, was the only thing that mattered. The army that marched into Valley Forge in December of 1777 was not the army that had crossed the Delaware 12 months earlier. It was smaller, it was more ragged. It had fought 2 major engagements, Brandywine and Germantown, and lost both. The British had taken Philadelphia, the American capital, and were wintering there in relative comfort, while Washington's men made their way to a plateau above the Schuylkill River 20 miles to the northwest, to spend the winter in whatever shelter they could build with their own hands. Approximately 12,000 soldiers entered the Valley Forge encampment. Washington ordered them to build huts, standardized dimensions, assigned by regiment, constructed from the timber of the surrounding forests. They built nearly 2,000 structures in the weeks that followed. They built them while hungry, while cold, while wearing clothing that had been inadequate in November and was disintegrating by January. 1/3 of them had no functional shoes. General Johann de Kalb wrote on Christmas Day, 1777, "It is very certain that half the army is almost naked, in a great measure barefoot. The Marquis de Lafayette, young and not yet accustomed to the miseries of a continental winter, wrote home to France that the soldiers had neither coats, nor hats, nor shoes, that their feet and legs froze until they were black, and that it was sometimes necessary to amputate. The supply system had failed. The roads were bad. The Continental Congress was struggling to fund an army that the states were not adequately supporting. On some days, the only thing the men ate was fire cake, a paste of flour and water cooked directly on heated stones, tasteless and barely sustaining. A surgeon named Albigence Waldo kept a diary that winter. He wrote with the dark frankness of a man who had stopped pretending. Poor food, hard lodging, cold weather, fatigue, nasty clothes. Why are we sent here to starve and freeze? And then, on another page, the same man described a soldier moving through camp, barefoot, half-dressed, coat in rags, singing, not performing. Singing, Waldo wrote, in a voice that suggested he had not yet decided to stop believing in what he was doing. Washington read reports like this, and wrote to Congress with a controlled fury that, in another man, would have been despair. He described what he was seeing without embellishment, because embellishment gave officials a reason to discount the account. He asked for food, clothing, shoes, medicine. He asked for the supply system to be reformed. Congress sent committees. Some things improved. Washington did not leave Valley Forge, not for a single night. He could have found warmer quarters. He could have accepted any number of invitations to winter in comfort elsewhere, as other senior officers sometimes did. He chose not to. He stayed in his stone headquarters at the edge of the encampment, close enough to the men to know what they were enduring, visible enough that they knew he had not gone anywhere. He could not fix the supply system from Valley Forge. He could not conjure food or shoes or warm coats from the frozen Pennsylvania air. What he could do, the only thing, in some weeks, that was within his power, was stay. And he stayed. In late February of 1778, a Prussian officer named Friedrich von Steuben arrived at Valley Forge with a letter of introduction and an offer to help. He did not speak English. He drilled the Continental Army anyway. Through an interpreter, then through junior officers, he trained to train others, then through the sheer force of a personality that found American soldiers genuinely delightful in their informality and was determined to make them formidable in spite of it. He wrote a training manual. He demonstrated musket technique in the mud. He swore at his men in French and German because his English was not yet up to the task, and his men drilled harder because they found it so entertaining. By spring, the army that marched out of Valley Forge was not the army that had marched in. It was not larger. It was not better equipped. But it knew how to move, how to reload under fire, how to hold a line when the instinct was to run. It had been tempered by the winter in a way that no summer campaign could have managed. Washington rode out of Valley Forge in June of 1778 and turned his army south toward the British as they evacuated Philadelphia. Behind him, the plateau above the Schuylkill River was quiet again. The huts stood empty in the early summer light. The fires were out. The traces in the frozen ground had long since melted into the spring thaw, gone now, invisible, as if they had never been there. But they had been there. Washington had seen them. He had written about them. And in the years that followed, through Yorktown, through Newburgh, through the presidency and the long retirement and the final December morning at Mount Vernon, he never forgot what it looked like when men gave everything they had and then were asked to give a little more. He never forgot, and he never looked away. Some men are made by their victories, and Washington was made by the winters in between, by what he chose to do when winning was not an option and staying was the only thing left. He had stayed. The army had held. And now, on the far side of the worst winter of the war, something had shifted, not just in the army, but in the man who had refused to leave it. The question that had been following Washington since the frontier, since Fort Necessity, since the long, grinding years of the French and Indian War, the question of whether he was equal to what was being asked of him, had not been answered by Trenton or Princeton. Those were victories, and victories were easy to explain. Valley Forge was harder to explain. Valley Forge was just endurance, just presence. Just the daily decision to stay when leaving would have been so much simpler. And yet it was Valley Forge, more than any battlefield, that made the men who served there trust him completely, not because he had led them to victory, but because he had refused to abandon them in defeat. That trust would matter soon. More than anyone standing in the mud of Valley Forge in the winter of 1777 could yet know, it would matter enormously in a room in Newburgh, New York, 5 years later, on an afternoon when the revolution itself came very close to devouring everything it had built. There is a pair of spectacles, the kind a man reaches for without thinking, the way you reach for something you have reached for 1,000 times. Washington had begun needing them in recent years. The long campaigns, the endless correspondence written and read by candlelight, the accumulated strain of eyes that had been asked to do too much for too long. He did not wear them in public if he could avoid it. They were a private thing, a concession to time that he would rather not have had to make. But on a March afternoon in 1783, in a room full of officers who were considering something that would have ended the American experiment before it had properly begun, he reached for them, and everything changed. The road to that room had taken 5 years and covered a continent. After Valley Forge, the war had shifted in ways Washington had been too disciplined to hope for openly, but had never stopped working toward. The alliance with France, formalized in February of 1778, transformed the strategic picture entirely. The British were no longer fighting a colonial rebellion. They were fighting a world war, with French naval power threatening their supply lines, their Caribbean possessions, and the fundamental assumption that Britannia ruled the seas without serious challenge. Washington spent the better part of 3 years in the grinding middle work of keeping an army in the field. He won some engagements. He lost others. He managed the politics of a coalition that included French allies with their own priorities, state militias that answered to their own governors, and a Continental Congress that remained chronically unable to fund the war it had declared. He wrote letters, thousands of them. He kept the machinery moving by the force of correspondence alone in weeks when nothing else was working, and he waited. He was, underneath everything, a man who understood the strategic value of patience, who had learned on the frontier that an enemy who overextended himself would eventually create an opportunity, and that the most important quality a commander could possess was the discipline not to act before that opportunity arrived. The opportunity arrived at Yorktown. In the late summer of 1781, a French naval victory off the Virginia coast changed everything. Admiral de Grasse defeated the British fleet at the Battle of the Chesapeake on the 5th of September, 1781, cutting off British General Cornwallis, who had moved his army to Yorktown on the Virginia Peninsula, from any hope of naval resupply or evacuation. Washington, who had been planning an attack on New York, pivoted with a speed that surprised everyone, including his own staff, and marched his combined American and French forces south. The siege of Yorktown began in late September. It was conducted with professional precision, the French engineers directing the construction of parallel trenches, the artillery moving forward in systematic stages, the noose tightening around Cornwallis's position with the unhurried certainty of a proof being worked out on paper. Washington fired the first cannon of the formal bombardment himself on the 9th of October, 1781. On the 17th, Cornwallis requested terms. On the 19th, the formal surrender took place on a field outside Yorktown. The British band played a song called "The World Turned Upside Down." Cornwallis himself did not appear. He sent a subordinate, claiming illness, which was the 18th century's way of saying that some humiliations were too large to perform in person. Washington, understanding the protocol, sent his own second-in-command to receive the sword. It was over. Not formally, the Treaty of Paris would not be signed until September of 1783. But Yorktown was the end of any realistic British hope of military victory, and everyone present understood it. Washington wrote to Congress that evening with the brevity of a man who had learned not to celebrate before the work was finished. He reported the surrender. He named the officers who had distinguished themselves. He asked that arrangements be made for the prisoners. That was all. The 20 months between Yorktown and the Treaty of Paris were, in some ways, the most dangerous of the entire revolution. The fighting had stopped. The peace had not yet been signed, and the Continental Army, 8 years of accumulated grievance, unpaid wages, unfulfilled promises, the particular bitterness of men who had given everything and were being asked to wait a little longer for what they had been promised, was encamped at Newburgh, New York, and running out of patience. The grievances were real. Officers had been promised half-pay pensions for life, and had no confidence Congress would honour the commitment. Enlisted men were owed months, sometimes years, of back wages. The civilian government the army had bled to establish seemed, from Newburgh, to regard the army as a problem to be managed rather than a debt to be paid. In March of 1783, anonymous letters began to circulate through the officer corps. They were inflammatory, precise, and dangerous, arguing that the army had been patient long enough, that the time for petitions had passed, and that more forceful measures might be necessary. A meeting of officers was called. Washington did not ignore it. He did not suppress it. He called his own meeting for the same time and place, and he showed up. The room was full of men who respected him enormously and were angry enough, in that moment, to consider doing something that would have destroyed everything they had built together. Some of them had served with him since 1775. Some of them had been at Valley Forge. Some of them had crossed the Delaware in the dark on Christmas night, half frozen, because he had asked them to. They had trusted him through all of it. And now he was asking them to trust him one more time. He stood before them and spoke about honor, about the difference between a grievance addressed through legitimate means and a grievance addressed through force, about what it would mean for the country, for the cause, for every man in that room, if the army they had built became the instrument of its own government's destruction. They listened. They were not entirely persuaded. And then Washington reached into his coat pocket. He unfolded a letter from a member of Congress, evidence that the civilian government was aware of the army's situation and was attempting to address it. He held the paper up. He looked at it. The room had seen Washington in battle. They had seen him in council. They had seen him in the long, exhausted winters and the brief, bright moments of victory. They had seen him at Valley Forge, staying when other men left. They had not seen him like this, reaching for glasses with the slightly self-conscious deliberateness of a man who would rather not need them, doing it anyway because the letter had to be read and there was no point in pretending. He put them on. He looked up at his officers. "Gentlemen," he said, "you will permit me to put on my spectacles, for I have not only grown grey but almost blind in the service of my country." Several men began to weep, not because the line was moving, though it was, not because Washington had planned it, there is no evidence he had, but because it was true, because they had watched it happen, because the man standing before them had given the same years they had given, had endured the same winters, had written the same unanswered letters to the same indifferent institutions, and was still standing there, asking them to believe that it was worth it. The meeting ended without incident. The conspiracy dissolved. Washington had ended it not with a threat, not with an order, not with the authority of rank, but with a pair of spectacles and one sentence that reminded a room full of exhausted men who they were and what they had agreed to stand for. He finished reading the letter. He folded his glasses. He put them back in his pocket. He moved on to the next item of business. He did not write about the moment in his diary. He did not make a speech about it afterward. Some things do not need to be annotated. Some victories are won in silence. He rode back to Mount Vernon that spring for the first time in years, not as a general returning from campaign, but as a man who had surrendered his commission and intended, this time to stay. 3 years, he told himself. 3 years of the fields, and the river, and the early mornings, and the work that he understood, and that understood him. The country let him have those years. And then it needed him again. He had known it would. Some part of him had always known. But for now, for 3 years that felt, to a man who had spent a decade at war, like an entire lifetime compressed into the space of a few quiet seasons, the key was back in his hand. The door was open, and George Washington, for the second time in his life, came home. There is a chair. He had been home for 3 years when history came looking for him again. It sits on a raised platform 3 feet above the floor of the Senate chamber at Federal Hall in New York City, a neoclassical armchair positioned beneath a canopy of crimson silk. Above it, the ceiling arches upward in blue, painted with a sun at its center and 13 stars arranged around it. The windows are hung with crimson damask. The marble mantels catch the light from the street below. It is a room designed to confer importance on whoever sits at its center. On the 30th of April, 1789, George Washington sat down in that chair. Senator William Maclay of Pennsylvania, a skeptic by temperament, not given to sentiment, wrote in his diary that Washington seemed more agitated and embarrassed than he had ever appeared before the levelled cannon or the pointed musket of the British. Representative Fisher Ames of Massachusetts recalled a man visibly shaking, speaking in a voice so low that those in the back of the chamber had to lean forward to hear. The man who had not flinched at Braddock's ambush, the man who had ridden through the collapsing lines at Long Island, the man who had stood at Newburgh and dissolved a conspiracy with a pair of spectacles and 1 sentence, that man was shaking. He was shaking because he understood, more clearly than anyone else in that room, what was actually being asked of him, not just the presidency. Something larger and more permanent than that. He was being asked to show the world what a free republic looked like when it worked, and he knew, better than anyone, how easily it could fail. He had not wanted to be here. The 3 years at Mount Vernon after Newburgh had been everything he had promised himself they would be. He rose before dawn. He rode the fields. He corresponded with farmers across the Atlantic about crop rotation and soil management. He redesigned his gardens. He watched the river in the mornings and counted himself, for the first time in a decade, genuinely at peace. And then the country began to come apart. The Articles of Confederation, the framework under which the United States had been governing itself since 1777, were proving inadequate to the task they had been designed for. The central government had no power to tax. It could not regulate commerce between states, which had begun to behave less like partners in a union and more like rival nations. It could not enforce its own laws. It could not pay its debts, including the debts it owed to the men who had fought the Revolution. In the late summer of 1786, a Massachusetts farmer and former Continental soldier named Daniel Shays led an armed uprising of debtors against the state government, men who had fought for a country that was now seizing their farms to pay taxes they had no money to pay. The rebellion was suppressed, but it sent a tremor through the political class that had been telling itself the Confederation was workable. Washington read the reports from Mount Vernon and wrote to James Madison, "We are fast verging to anarchy and confusion." Madison was already working on something. He and Alexander Hamilton and others had been quietly building the case for a constitutional convention, a gathering to redesign the framework of American government from the ground up. They needed Washington, not just his presence. His legitimacy, his name, the closest thing the new nation had to a guarantee that what was being proposed was not a power grab by ambitious men. Washington did not want to go. He had already resigned once. He had already walked away when walking away was the honourable thing to do, and the country had called it greatness, and he had accepted the designation and gone back to his gardens. To go back now, to return to public life after having left it so deliberately, felt like a contradiction of everything he had stood for at Newburgh. He went anyway. Because Madison asked him, and because Washington understood, as clearly as he understood anything, that the fragile thing he had helped build was about to collapse if someone did not hold it together. The Constitutional Convention met in Philadelphia from May to September of 1787. Washington was elected its presiding officer on the first day, unanimously, without debate. He did not speak often during the proceedings. His role was to sit at the front of the room and be George Washington, to lend his presence to the work in a way that made the deliberations of 55 delegates feel like something more than a political negotiation. When the debates grew heated, when the compromises required to hold the convention together seemed too great to bear, the fact of Washington at the front of the room was itself an argument for continuing. He was the living proof that disinterested service was possible, that a man could hold power and give it back, that the thing they were trying to build was not naive. The Constitution that emerged from Philadelphia in September of 1787 was imperfect. Its framers knew it, said so openly, and built into it the mechanisms for amendment that have been used in the centuries since. It contained, embedded in its compromises, the accommodation of slavery in a document premised on the equality of men. Washington signed it. He went back to Mount Vernon and waited to see whether the states would ratify it. They did, narrowly, contentiously, with the promise of a Bill of Rights attached. The first presidential election was held in the winter of 1788. By February of 1789, the result was known. Every elector had cast one of their 2 votes for Washington. The result was unanimous, the only time in American history a president has been elected without a single dissenting vote. Washington received the official notification at Mount Vernon on April 14, 1789. He wrote in his diary that evening that he was setting out the following morning with feelings not unlike those of a culprit going to his execution. He was not being falsely modest. He meant it. He arrived in New York to crowds that lined the streets for miles, that stood on rooftops and hung from windows and wept openly at the sight of him passing. He found the spectacle both moving and faintly alarming, a people projecting onto one man a weight of hope that no man should have to carry. He had seen what happened when men were given that kind of devotion. He had been offered it himself at Newburgh and had refused it. He could not refuse it now. The country needed him to carry it, and so he would carry it. He took the oath of office on the balcony of Federal Hall on April 30th, 1789. He went inside. He sat down in the chair beneath the crimson canopy. He looked out at a chamber full of men who were waiting for him to invent, from nothing, what an American presidency looked like. There was no template. There was no predecessor. Every decision Washington made, how to address himself, how to receive visitors, how formal to be and when, how to balance the demands of dignity and accessibility, would become precedent, would become the thing that every president after him either followed or deliberately departed from. He understood this completely. It was why he was shaking. The 8 years that followed were not the peaceful administration Washington had hoped to preside over. Alexander Hamilton, as Secretary of the Treasury, proposed a financial system that would bind the interests of wealthy Americans to the survival of the federal government. Thomas Jefferson, as Secretary of State, believed Hamilton's system was a betrayal of the Revolution. Washington stood between them and tried, for years, to hold the cabinet together by the force of his conviction that unity mattered more than any individual policy position. He succeeded longer than anyone else could have managed. He did not succeed forever. The Whiskey Rebellion of 1794, farmers in western Pennsylvania refusing to pay a federal excise tax, required Washington to lead a federal force into the field. He put on his uniform. He rode her. The rebellion collapsed before he arrived. But the precedent had been established. The new government's authority would not be defied by force without a response. France and Britain went to war in 1793, and both sides immediately demanded that the United States choose. Washington refused. His proclamation of neutrality infuriated the French, who believed the alliance of 1778 obligated American support, and the British, who regarded neutrality as an insult. He was accused of being a monarchist by the Republican press and a French sympathizer by the Federalist press. He found it, the letters of his final presidential years make clear, genuinely painful in a way that cannon fire never had been. He had spent his life earning the respect of the people he served. To watch his name become a weapon in arguments that had nothing to do with him, that was a different kind of wound entirely. One that did not heal the way the others had. In September of 1796, Washington published his farewell address. He had been working on it for years, refining it, shaping it into something that was less a goodbye than a warning. He warned against permanent alliances with foreign nations. He warned against the spirit of party, the tendency of political factions to prioritize their own survival over the good of the country. He warned against the assumption that any region could prosper at the expense of the others. Some of his warnings have been heeded. Some have not. They are still being argued about. He did not seek a third term. On the 4th of March, 1797, John Adams was inaugurated as the second President of the United States. Washington sat in the audience. When Adams entered the room, the crowd's attention shifted, as it should, as Washington had designed it to, toward the new president. Washington watched the transfer of power he had made possible and felt, by his own later account, something close to relief. He had held it. He had used it carefully. He had defined, by the simple act of giving it back, what it was supposed to mean. For the third time in his life, after the frontier, after the war, after the presidency, George Washington turned his back on the world that had been asking things of him and went home. He had a key. He had a river. He had a pair of boots that needed wearing out. And for 2 years, that was enough. There is a will, 12 pages, handwritten, dated the 9th of July, 1799. The hand has slowed with age. The letters are formed with more effort than they once required. But they are legible. They are precise. They say exactly what he meant them to say. He wrote it himself. He did not dictate it. He did not ask a lawyer to compose it and present it for a signature. It is, in that sense, the last notebook, the last careful record kept by a man who had been keeping careful records since he was a boy, measuring land on the Virginia frontier since he was 14 years old, copying rules into a hand-stitched journal by candlelight, since he first understood that the world did not keep track of things on your behalf, and that if you wanted something to be remembered, you had better write it down yourself. Near the end of the document, after the disposition of his land and his livestock and his household goods, there is a clause. It reads, "Upon the decease of my wife, it is my will and desire that all the slaves which I hold in my own right shall receive their freedom." Not all the enslaved people at Mount Vernon, many of them belonged to the Custis estate, and were not Washington's to free. That legal reality was a constraint he could not dissolve with a pen. But the ones who were his, the ones over whose fate he held actual legal authority, those he would free. After Martha died, not immediately, after, it was not a full reckoning. The men and women who had built Mount Vernon with their bodies, who had risen before Washington did and worked after he had gone inside, who had been held in bondage by the machinery of an institution Washington had benefited from for 67 years, they deserved more than a clause in a will written in the final months of a long life. History has noted this, and rightly, but the clause was there, written in his own hand, in the same careful script he had used for everything that mattered to him. And Washington was one of very few founding fathers who left even that much behind. He knew the contradiction had not been resolved. The letters of his later years circle it, carefully worded, never quite direct, but present. He wrote to friends that he hoped the Union might find some way to address the question of slavery without the violence he feared it would eventually require. He wrote that he would not, by any act of his own, agitate the issue publicly while he lived, because he believed the fragile Union he had spent his life building could not survive the agitation. He was right that the Union was fragile. Whether postponement was wisdom or failure is a question the decades that followed answered in their own terrible way. The will was his final accounting, incomplete and real. When he wrote it in the summer of 1799, he had already been home for more than 2 years. He had come home to Mount Vernon in March of 1797, with the particular relief of a man who has been handed back something he thought he had lost for good. The presidency was behind him. The wars were behind him. What remained, what he had left, in the time that was left, was this: the fields, the river, the house he had spent 40 years making into something worth coming home to, the boots by the door, the mornings. He threw himself into it with an energy that surprised even those who knew him well. He redesigned the crop rotation across the 5 farms of the estate. He experimented with a 16-sided threshing barn of his own design, a structure that used horses walking in circles on a wooden floor to separate wheat from its husks, an innovation that reduced the labour required and increased the yield. He wrote long letters to agricultural societies. He was happiest in these final years, when the work was physical and the results were visible, and what was being built was something he could walk around and assess with his own eyes. He was not a reflective man by disposition. He did not spend his retirement composing memoirs or philosophical essays about the meaning of what he had done. He left that to Jefferson and Adams, both engaged in elaborate posthumous reputation management from their respective retirements. Washington rode his fields. Martha was there. She had always been there, through 38 years of marriage, through the winters at Valley Forge, where she had come to be with him, through the presidency where she had presided over a household that was half home and half diplomatic institution, through all the years of departure and return and departure again. They were old now, both of them. The partnership that had begun as a practical arrangement between 2 capable adults had become, over the decades, something that required no description and no maintenance. They moved through the house with the ease of 2 people who had long since stopped needing to explain themselves to each other. Washington still rose before dawn. In the evenings he read newspapers, agricultural reports, the correspondence that continued to arrive from people who wanted his opinion on matters he had officially retired from having opinions about. He noted the condition of the peach trees, the behaviour of the Potomac in flood season, the quality of a morning in late October when the light came in low and gold across the river. He had earned this. He allowed himself, in these final years, to inhabit it fully, the way a man inhabits a room he has spent his whole life trying to get back to. On the 12th of December, 1799, Washington rode out across his farms in weather that was turning bad, cold rain shifting to sleet as the afternoon wore on, the temperature dropping through a grey sky that had no interest in improving. He did not stop doing it because the weather was difficult. That had never been the kind of man he was. He came in late. That evening, he mentioned to his secretary, Tobias Lear, that he felt a soreness in his throat. During the night, the soreness worsened. He woke Martha. He could barely speak. The treatments applied through the day of December 13th were the standard remedies of the era, bloodletting, repeated several times as Washington's condition worsened rather than improved. He lost, by later estimates, nearly 40% of his blood volume over the course of the day. Modern medical historians have concluded, with near unanimity, that the treatments accelerated his death rather than preventing it. He knew he was dying before his physicians fully accepted it. He was calm. This is the detail that appears in every account from those present, from Lear, from the physicians, from the enslaved attendants who had been with him for years, and who moved through that house with a grief the formal record does not adequately capture. Washington was calm. He gave instructions. He asked that his body not be entombed for at least 2 days after his death. He had some concern about being buried alive, a fear not uncommon in the 18th century. He settled the remaining affairs of his life with the same methodical attention he had always brought to things that needed to be done. Late in the evening of December 14th, 1799, he spoke to Tobias Lear. "I am just going," he said. "Have me decently buried, and do not let my body be put into the vault in less than 3 days after I am dead." Lear, weeping, told him it would be done. Washington looked at him. "'Tis well," he said. He died shortly after 10 o'clock that night. He was buried at Mount Vernon, on the slope above the Potomac, in the vault on the estate he had spent his life building. Napoleon Bonaparte ordered 10 days of mourning in France. The British fleet lowered its flags. In the United States, Henry Lee delivered the eulogy that produced the phrase which has followed Washington ever since. First in war, first in peace, first in the hearts of his countrymen. It was true. It was also, like all eulogies, insufficient. It named what he had done. It could not name what it had cost, the winters, the letters, the long silences, the key hanging by the door of a house he kept having to leave. What cannot be said in a eulogy is smaller than that. A boy of 11, standing in a Virginia farmhouse in the spring of 1743, understanding for the first time that the shape of his life had just changed in a way he could not yet measure. A 14-year-old copying rules of conduct into a notebook, slowly, carefully, as if the act of writing them down could make him into the person they described. A young man on a horse, compass in hand, walking the boundary of land that was not yet his, learning the shape of a world that had not yet decided what it thought of him. A husband who did not say what things cost him. A commander who did not leave when the nights were coldest. A president who shook when he sat down in the chair, not from fear, but from the full weight of understanding what was being placed in his hands. A man who, twice in his life, held the kind of power that most men spend their lives reaching for, and gave it back, not because he did not want it, but because he understood something that very few men in his position have ever understood, that the moment of letting go is the moment that matters most. The Potomac is quiet in December. The fields of Mount Vernon slope down to the water in the grey winter light, the same as they always have. The house stands on the rise above the river, white against the bare trees, looking out over the lawn and the water and the low Maryland hills beyond. The boots are just inside the door, mud-caked, worn at the heel, still carrying the shape of the man who wore them, the shape of someone who believed, to the last morning of his life, that land required watching, and that no weather was a good enough reason to stay inside. He grew up without a father, in a silence that followed him everywhere he went. He never found what he had lost. But somewhere along the way, in the fields, in the winters, in the long spaces between the things he could not bring himself to say, a country found something in him, and called him by the only name it had for what he had become.